You're live.
Oh, okay. For some reason, I'm still hearing the music.
You're good. Go
All
for
right.
it.
Welcome, everybody. Really sorry about these difficulties here. I think sometimes we're coordinating, trying to get everybody in. Sometimes we kind of get bogged down and trying to make it work, so it's actually worthwhile when we do show up on the air. But I'm here to tell you that we are on now, and I have with me via audio Professor William Darity, professor at Duke University. And I remember at one point I referred to him as a structural economist, or really the more correct term is a stratification economist. But Professor, I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to you and have you introduce yourself to everyone.
Oh, thank you, Nick, very much. I'm William Darity, better known as Sandy, and I am the director of the Samuel Du Bois Cook Center on Social Equity at Duke, which is a research center that's focused on inequality, both globally and within the United States, and especially between racial, ethnic, and gender groups.
There's a lot of stuff you just said right there, and all of it is, worth its weight in gold is what I want to emphasize. We have a huge stuff we can talk about. We're probably not going to be able to really cover everything like I would usually like to cover everything, but let's go ahead and just start with kind of like the narrative. Like, oftentimes I talk to people and, we seem to do our politics in terms of us being an individual. And this is something that, it's easier to think of like solutions and what needs to be done in an individual because that's how you operate, right? That's how you live your life. However, what I want to emphasize is a lot of times, we're just individuals and we're operating, but oftentimes we don't necessarily have control of the environment that we're operating in. And I think that environment is set by policy. So kind of, let's kind of go through why would you, term what you study stratification and what does that mean and how it relates to what I was just speaking about right there.
So stratification analysis has a long tradition in sociology. And folks actually say that they're specialists in stratification analysis in sociology. But in economics, there's been much less of a tendency to hone in on questions of what are the processes that generate hierarchy, generate inequality, generate unfairness or inequities in societies. And so as an economist, I thought it would be useful to try to craft a new subfield within economics that was focused on those sorts of issues and focused on those issues in such a way that we don't take the position that those groups that are in a subordinate position or a disadvantaged position are there because of their own behaviors or dysfunctional activities, but rather they're there because of the way in which the society structures disadvantage and structures inequality. So your use of the term structural is important because stratification economics as a field, in the way that I envision it, is looking for structural explanations for the kinds of disparities and inequalities that we observe, particularly economic disparities between social groups.
That is particularly important. I like what you said there when you said, that instead of blaming someone for basically being where they are in terms of the social structure of our society, we need to examine the structures that create situations that give people those types of outcomes, regardless of their inputs, right? Regardless of their merit, so to speak. This really kind of goes back into like the meritocracy argument that we have here in America, where, you feel like individuals rise and fall based on their own merit, but that flies in the face of reality, and I think that's why your work and specifically this field is particularly important to people. So, let's talk about some of the stunning findings. Like, all the time I hear people and they'll talk about the the exceptions. They'll say, well, so and so went from rags to riches, and this person, you know, is a self-made millionaire. And a lot of times they're speaking about athletes or people who did something, you know, really kind of, you know, had a perfect storm of favorable opportunities land on them all at the same time, so they can become, you know, the powerhouses that they are today. And people think that that's something that everyone can do. Kind of put it into context in terms of your work and why that's just not true.
So one of the things that I'd like to say is that frequently when it looks as though people have made it from rags to riches, that's not the case. I think we'd be hard pressed to describe the accomplishments of someone like Donald Trump as a matter of moving from rags to riches. But even in other cases that are not quite as flamboyant, you know, often individuals have had some kind of boost from their parents or grandparents or other relatives in terms of the resources that have been provided to them, in terms of the educational opportunities that they might have had that others lacked, in terms of the receipt of certain forms of property across generations. So there's a lot of factors that are involved in individual success or accomplishment that's tied to what they inherit or receive from previous generations. And I think that we underestimate the magnitude of the significance of that. Now, of course, there's always a handful of folks who are true outliers, who manage to be extremely successful starting with very little. But those are folks who are exactly that, outliers. And what we need to pay close attention to is the average experience of most individuals in the community. That's really a much stronger indicator of the extent to which our society really behaves in a way that's just or fair for all of its citizens. I lost my volume here. I can't hear you, Nick.
You're on mute.
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry, guys. I forgot to click my mute button. The reason why I want to go through that is because I want to kind of apply these analysis and conclusions. So if every person's success or failure is not directly tied to their individual merit, and they are really operating within structures set up by society, and we have to look at, you know, well, politics shapes, you know, those structures, right? So why is it that we have this huge divorce from understanding that these structures are adjusted by politics? It's like it's almost completely divorced. Like everybody believes that the individual solution is really the answer to everyone's problems, and like you said, they'll prop up the exceptional person, but you don't make policy based on the exception. You make policy based on the standard.
Right. And I think that's the critical thing, is that if we're thinking about the experience of the typical individual, that should be the basis for making our judgments about how to try to change or transform our society for the better, not the experiences of individuals who are extraordinary exceptions. And I would add to that once we start thinking in those ways, we no longer remain tied to the notion that that this is a society that operates in such a way that if you work hard, if you're motivated, if you're creative, that ensures that you will be a success. So, you know, one of the things that we've discovered in the research that we've done on our National Asset Scorecard for Communities of Color project, and this is work that I've done primarily with Derek Hamilton at the New School, but also with Kaizen and with Mark Paul. One of the things that we found in that work is that blacks who have a college degree have 2/3 of the net worth of whites who never finished high school. We also found that blacks who are working full time have less net worth or wealth than whites who are unemployed. So working hard, studying hard is not an assurance that you're going to have a comparable level of wealth or net worth as whites in the United States. And that's just indicative of what I would view as a structural unfairness in the society.
So
That's
let me
the transmission of resources across generations.
Let me interject and emphasize there on something. You just said that African Americans or Black Americans in America, blacks in America, with college degrees have less wealth than their white counterparts who have no college education.
That's right. In fact, it's at the median, it's $10,000 less, which is not really a trivial sum, especially given the fact that the median net worth for the average Black household in the United States is about $6,000.
See, that's a hard number to really look at, because all your life you'll hear, well, all you have to do is go to school. All you have to do is go to school and work hard, and you can be someone. And it's like you basically you're basically telling your children that, you need to be the exception. And, at a certain point, it kind of comes up. It's like, well, what about the people that aren't exceptional? Are they just supposed to be, left to the wayside? That's not a strategy, for everybody. That's a strategy for a few people to make it, but that's not something that the community, everybody in the community should be, that shouldn't be their goal when it comes to, kind of raising children. We need to start analyzing that if our goal is really to lift everyone, in that community, you can't use that exceptional model.
So in our country, I think, it's no more than about 30% of the American population that achieves a college degree. And so in that sense, folks who are college educated are exceptions because they are actually a minority of the population overall. But the point that's critical here is that if you are Black and part of that group of folks who have achieved a college degree, while that might give you a higher income in comparison with other Black folks, it will not close the gap, especially with respect to something like wealth between you and the vast majority of white Americans. And I'd also add that higher levels of education do not provide the same degree of insulation from unemployment for Blacks as it does for whites. So we know quite well that the Black unemployment rate is 2 times as high as the white unemployment rate historically, but it's also 2 times as high at every level of educational attainment. And in fact, and here's the striking statistic, for Blacks who have some college education, the unemployment rate that they experience is actually higher than the unemployment rate for whites who dropped out of high school. So it's not the case that education is irrelevant or a bad thing. I'd be a hypocrite to say that as a college professor. But the key point is that educational attainment in and of itself will not eliminate racial inequality in the United States.
Now, that is something that it seems like nobody really wants to examine that. When we think about wealth, I've read the book Outliers and by Malcolm Gladwell. I remember when I read that book, that's what kind of shattered me on the meritocratic myth that America is just about rugged individualism and everybody making it, right? That kind of just there's timing involved. It's not always about talent. It's about who and things of that nature. And we all we know that. Yet for some reason, when it comes to applying that knowledge to what we expect in policymaking or how we view or how we're going to teach our children or what kind of world we want to live in, we just kind of forget that. And we still fall into that meritocratic myth. And I'm like, I don't know if it's a disconnect or it's like, take for instance, I'm just going to illustrate it a little bit better for our audience. Take for instance, you have somebody who steals. This person steals. They've stolen from you before and lied to you about it. Yet when something comes up missing and you can't find it, you still don't suspect that it may have been stolen by that person, because it's like, the person steals, but you didn't take that knowledge and let it impact your decision the next time. Now, I know that's not necessarily a fair comparison, but I'm just trying to make the point that we need to make sure we apply both the past knowledge, all of it, to our critical decision making and really our knowledge about how we see the world.
Well, actually, there's a historical pattern of theft that goes beyond individuals stealing from another individual, but goes to the question of some sort of forms of collective theft. So, for example, I mean, the first form of significant collective theft that occurred vis-a-vis Black folks was the theft of their labor, their coerced labor via slavery.
Mm-hmm.
A second form of theft was in the process of the in the period of the Reconstruction era and thereafter. Black folks made made strong efforts to accumulate property in the South, even though they were denied the promise of 40 acres and a mule. At their own behest, they managed to accumulate a significant amount of property in the South, and that property was progressively taken from them, appropriated. They were driven off the land by white terrorists. So that was another form of theft. So we also have to address not only what you talked about, the theft that individuals taking from others, and then subsequently being silent about it or denying it, but we also have to think about collective theft and actually the very building of this nation on the basis of collective theft. So that leads me, of course, to the perspective that what really is demanded is reparations for African Americans.
Now that is something where I mean, I think here what we're struggling with is sometimes we can be right, but I think in America what we've seen is that being right is just not enough, if that makes any sense. Like, I think we have a situation now where we're just being right and having the right moral case, or having an actual real case, straight up dead to rights, right, is not enough, because we, as you've already said, we are a minority here with 13% of the population. So how can we go about getting something like that done? And let's say we were to go about doing something like that, how can it be done, and what would it look like? What kind of shape would it take?
Well, I think the first thing is that we have to craft a new narrative, or craft in some sense, an older narrative or a more accurate narrative of the very history of this country. I'm thinking in particular about the way in which reparations was provided for Japanese Americans who were subjected to incarceration during World War II. That one of the first steps in that process was the formation of a congressional commission that had the responsibility of providing a report on that entire historical period. And one of their key findings was that U.S. officials who engineered the incarceration of the Japanese Americans actually knew full well that Japanese Americans were not a threat to national security. Nevertheless, they were incarcerated. Whereas, for example, German Americans or Italian Americans who might have had some emotional or political ties to either Germany or Italy were not incarcerated. So it was specifically directed at Japanese Americans. And the commission report was critical in establishing that incarceration was an unjust act. So similarly, I think we need to start with a commission that's formed to address the entire historical relationship between Black Americans and social practices in this country. And in particular, I believe Representative John Conyers has had a resolution that's never gotten out of committee. House Resolution 40, I believe, is the number on it, which is intended to form precisely that type of commission. And I think we need that kind of commission to do the research and to provide a report, a nationally generated report that would provide the foundation for actually making a serious case for reparations. I
think the Black is Back Coalition may have gotten with that and maybe rewritten that to expand beyond that, but I will have to find a source on that. I believe they've updated it from researching, the need, and now basically, kind of trying to find ways that it can be implemented so they can have something ready to go should political wind shift and that be able to move forward. But
so
let me ask you.
I'm actually working on a book with Kirsten Mullen called "From Here to Equality," which is a book in which we are going to detail in an extensive way the case for reparations. But one of the features of that book is going to be a chapter on how to actually execute a reparations program. So, we've given a lot of thought to the issue of how you would actually structure or establish a reparations program and make it happen in a concrete way. So that's forthcoming with our own research effort.
Can you to move off of that topic? I know it also is a big one, but it's actually very, very huge. But I actually want to cover a little bit more before we run out of time, because we kind of got on kind of late. I want to say, I remember you spoke to me and we spoke about poverty standards and what they were, but how inaccurate they were, because a lot of times they focus a lot on income, whereas so much of what you can achieve, in America today is based off of your accumulated wealth or intergenerational wealth. Can you kind of speak about why income fails to really account for poverty, and why wealth is a much more accurate tool and the inequality there is much greater?
So income is more fragile in the sense that it's not a stock; it's a flow. It's a flow of new resources that usually are associated with our wage earning capacity. And so, if for some reason we lose a job, or if there's an extraordinary expense that's faced by the family, like a medical emergency, then our position, our security that's produced by our income is not going to be adequate. And so households or families that have high levels of wealth don't have to have anxiety about those conditions. They can weather the storm of a major emergency. They can weather the storm of a job loss or a huge medical expense in a way that other families and households can't. And then they don't have to face the emotional stress that's associated with worrying about trying to meet those kinds of emergency conditions. In addition, if you're a wealthy family in a society that is a plutocracy like ours, you have a greater capacity to participate in the political process and affect decisions about the distribution of resources. And furthermore, you also have the capacity to buy your way into a neighborhood that has higher levels of amenities, probably better quality schools, or if you're not satisfied with the public schools, if you're wealthy, you can send your kid to a Tony private school. So there's a range of opportunities, including the capacity to start a new business. There's a range of opportunities that people who have higher levels of wealth possess that's not associated with their income flows, but is associated with the difference between the value of their assets and their debts.
Yeah, see, I completely agree with you there, and that's not to even mention that let's say when you're wealthy, you actually can have your children completely secluded and they only interact with other wealthy children. That's like a class advantage, and that they can make decisions and help each other be successful through connections that your average child who's not amongst them ordinarily wouldn't have access to.
Yeah, so there's a social network effect that's associated with having more information about what the opportunities are that circulates among those folks who have higher levels of wealth in a way that it doesn't circulate among others. And in addition, if you're from a wealthier family, then you can take an internship, an unpaid internship, without it being a burden. And that's a foot in the door in many cases for a wider range of opportunities that also could enhance your economic security. I would add that it's a very interesting phenomenon now that the folks with the highest levels of wealth also are the folks with the highest levels of earnings. That we're having a convergence between folks who receive what we might refer to as super salaries and folks who have unusually high levels of wealth, so that it leads to a greater or a deeper concentration of inequality across the entire society as a consequence of that pattern.
Professor, we normally actually have to get off a little bit early here so Ben can prepare to do his stream tonight. I want to apologize to all the audience. You know, we've had some technical difficulties twice in a row, but I think we have them just about all nixed. So I'll probably have to do this conversation again, except we're probably going to actually focus on something, you know, that we didn't get to get in this conversation tonight. So I just want to say that that focus will probably be on, you know, policies that are going to be what you termed racially conscious but universal, or universal but racially conscious, and that's kind of where we kind of had a disagreement there when we said, you know, the rising tide will lift all boats kind of approach versus something that's race conscious but universal, which is essentially the same thing but sold in a different way and possibly implemented differently. I want to give you some time to actually go ahead and plug your book again and your research and remind everybody who you were, and then I'll go ahead and close out.
Okay. Thank you. I'll be glad to explore that with you at a later time.
Thank you guys for bearing with us. You know, we've been having some problems. I think we've got them all fixed, and we should be able to not run into this again. Remember, I will be back next month on the 6th for my normally scheduled show. And apparently, we're having an audio problem. I'll actually interact with the audience on that later. We'll go ahead and close it out, David.
Thank you.
Thanks.